Welcome to the 2021 American Psychological Association Convention. I'm so proud to introduce today the president of Division 32, the Society for Humanistic Psychology's wonderful Jonathan Raskin, to give his presidential address. Jonathan's address is entitled, Using Humanistic Psychology to Unite a Divided Nation. Dr. Raskin is a professor of psychology and counselor education at the State University of New York at New Paltz, where he is serving as chair of the psychology department. His research focuses on constructive, meaning-based approaches in psychology and counseling, especially their applications to understanding abnormality and psychotherapy. He is a licensed psychologist in New York, where he maintains a private practice and is also the managing editor of the Journal of Constructivist Psychology. Dr. Raskin authored the textbook, Abnormal Psychology, Contrasting Perspectives. Welcome, Dr. Raskin.
In his inaugural address this year, President Biden called for unity. He said that we needed unity because without it, there is no peace, only bitterness and fury. His call for unity has elicited enthusiasm in some quarters, but skepticism and, ironically, divisiveness in others. Two significant pitfalls undercut efforts at unity. First, we regularly become ensnared by the need to win and be right. We prioritize defending ourselves over staying open to alternative perspectives. Second, we often fail to heed or understand our adversaries' concerns. We spend too much time talking rather than listening. Luckily, humanistic psychology provides theoretical tools to help us avoid these pitfalls. Today, I'd like to discuss two humanistic approaches well suited for this task. First, J. Effrin's context-centered therapy and its notions of mind and self can aid us in confronting the first pitfall by fostering awareness of defensive postures that inhibit openness. Second, Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, with its core conditions for change, lets us overcome the second pitfall by encouraging mutual understanding. By combining context-centered and person-centered theories, a productive way forward just might emerge. Now, a caveat before proceeding. Embracing unity doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment or turning a blind eye to injustice. After all, unity can't be achieved without alleviating suffering and inequality. If someone abuses or mistreats me and then says, hey, let's just forget it in the name of unity, I can't reasonably be expected to comply. Unity must be distinguished from acquiescence. Achieving it requires reconciliation and addressing past wrongs. The humanist perspectives that I combine today acknowledge the importance of this proviso, and only by doing so can they foster unity. Now, the first step toward unity requires us to overcome the defensiveness and self-righteousness that plague our current political culture. To accomplish this, we need a theoretical conceptualization of the problem. Context-centered therapy provides a promising place to start. Developed by J. Effrin and colleagues, context-centered therapy is a humanistic constructivist approach influenced by Umberto Maturana's radical constructivism and George Kelly's personal construct psychology. It concentrates on how people make meaning within contexts, which are sets of psychological assumptions, presuppositions, that shape experience. Two contexts of particular importance are mind and self. By attending to mind-self discrepancies, humanistic psychologists gain a powerful tool to promote unity and overcome divisiveness. Now, when construing events via the context of mind, we adopt a defensive and self-protective posture. We see risk everywhere. We focus unwaveringly on safety and security. We feel victimized and taken advantage of by others. And we experience scarcity and depredation as ubiquitous. For example, we operate from mind at the morning breakfast buffet when we construe those around us as competitors, preventing us from securing our eggs, bacon, and coffee. We grab an extra serving or two because the mind is certain we will not receive our fair share. To make matters worse, when viewing the world from the vantage point of mind, people prioritize being right and winning at all costs. If they can't win, they will work tirelessly to at least avoid losing. So a car might cut me off on the highway, but I can even the score by speeding up and overtaking it in return, or if that's not feasible, at least giving the offending driver the finger. Now, although the mind sounds awful, it serves a highly functional purpose. Its unremitting negativism and sense of threat helps us evade the world's many hazards. However, the mind has evolved exclusively for survival. It cares not a whit about human happiness. Safety and security are its singular concerns. The self provides a broader context than the mind. Rather than construing others as dangerous competitors to be kept at bay or defeated, the self emphasizes connectedness and interrelatedness. When we function from the context of self, we're non-possessive, unselfish, open, generous, accepting, and loving. One might even say that the term self is a bit misleading because when we view the world from the perspective of self, our altruism and kindness are quite selfless. Nomenclature notwithstanding, one of the most important things we gain from the self is its appreciation of the mind's influence over our own behavior and that of others. So, when we're acting from self, we avoid characterizing others in essentialist terms. Rather than seeing the driver who cuts us off as an aggressive idiot, or the breakfast buffet patron who snatches the last donut as a greedy bore, we recognize their behavior as unfortunate instances of the mind in action. Now, we might disapprove of their conduct, but we neither take it personally nor assume it provides any particular insights into their fundamental character. This is because none of us is immune from the mind's pernicious effects. We all have mind-based moments for which we might seek forgiveness. So mind and self are contexts for making sense of our experiences that everyone alternates between. They aren't immutable underlying personality traits. Consequently, people can change by attending to the ways that their minds get the best of them. So summing some of this up, in a context-centered therapy perspective, when construing from a mind-based defensive posture, people become single-mindedly preoccupied with blaming, judging, securing, and winning. By contrast, when operating from the broader context of self, people shift to a more accepting, loving, caring, and giving orientation. The mind focuses exclusively on its narrow safety protocols and has no awareness of the self. But the self, being the broader and more inclusive context, deeply appreciates the mind as important and valuable, albeit limited. When acting from self, we acknowledge that all of us operate from mind sometimes. Now, the goal of context-centered therapy is to help people observe the mind from the context of self. Because we can't operate from both mind and self simultaneously, observing the mind from the context of self inevitably lessens the mind's influence. In this vein, context-centered therapy teaches people to accept the mind and be consciously aware of its activity. And this runs counter to approaches that try to squelch or quiet the mind and its thoughts and impulses. The mind cannot be denied. As the old saying goes, whatever you resist persists, whatever you let be, lets you be. So when I acknowledge and dispassionately observe my inclination to argue some arcane point for no other reason than to simply be right, or when I accept my irrational impulses to avoid compromising or resist something new because I fear losing, I inevitably find that these mind-based proclivities exert less hold over me. Now, mind-oriented construing is prevalent in politics, where success is often defined as implementing objectives at our adversary's expense. Current U.S. politics seems especially mind-driven, with Republicans and Democrats operating from a defensive posture that often places scoring political points ahead of collaboratively solving problems. Of course, Simply by saying this, I am likely to elicit strong mind-based reactions from you, such as, well, you can't collaborate with A and then fill in your favorite epithet. Socialist, insurrectionist, racist, fundamentalist, fanatic, etc. However, I encourage you to bracket your political orientation during this discussion because the perniciousness of the mind transcends partisan distinctions. It affects us all, regardless of political affiliation. To illustrate the mind's grip on our politics, let's consider two highly publicized political news items. And as we do so, try to suspend the inclination to identify who's right and who's wrong. Instead, aspire simply to observe and identify the mind in action. Example 1 has to do with blocking the January 6th Commission. Congressional Republicans have repeatedly blocked Democratic efforts to establish a commission to investigate the January 6th insurrection. This is a classic example of the mind doing what it does best, defending against perceived threats to avoid losing. A commission might have implicated the Republican Party in fomenting the events of January 6th. And this was threatening to Republicans who worried it might place them in the wrong. So they instinctively resisted by objecting and obfuscating. They complained that the proposed commission would have been biased, a purely political exercise, in the words of Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, that would have been short-sighted, duplicative, and potentially counterproductive, according to House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy. Republicans also resorted to whataboutism by demanding that Black Lives Matter and Antifa protests be investigated too. Because Republicans construed the proposed commission as deeply threatening, they blamed Democrats for treating them unfairly, an example of the mind's victim mentality. Negating rather than considering someone else's position, engaging in making other people wrong, and shifting culpability are all quintessential mind-based maneuvers to defend against perceived threats and avoid losing. Our minds get ugly when we feel under siege or don't get our way. Let's take a second example, disagreement over voting rights in the filibuster. Democrats have expressed outrage when a member of their own party, Senator Joe Manchin, stymied their legislative agenda by opposing the For the People voting rights bill and the elimination of the filibuster. Several resorted to archetypal mind-based strategies, such as blaming, characterizing, and castigating Manchin. For instance, Representative Jamal Bowman blasted Manchin as an obstructionist who has become the new Mitch McConnell and was doing everything in his power to stop democracy. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez further impugned Manchin's motives, speculating that his opposition to the voting rights bill was attributable to what she called the old ways of politics and Manchin's corrupt connections to dark money and lobbyists. Wanting to achieve outcomes they believe in, and feeling understandably threatened by Manchin's stance, Bowman and Ocasio-Cortez resorted to characteristic mind-driven strategies. Defeated at the legislative level, they at least were able to salvage a draw by disparaging Manchin's character, calling into question his motives, and making him wrong. Such is the pull of the mind. You may be asking, so what if politicians engage in mind-based recriminations? Isn't speaking truth to power a recognized strategy for generating change? Well, yes, it is. However, let us distinguish speaking truth by describing one's own experiences and interpretations while remaining open to what others are thinking and feeling, which is a self-based approach, from blaming, characterizing, and maybe making people wrong, which is a mind-driven tactic. The former invites others to engage with us and consider our viewpoint, while the latter demands that they get on board or be condemned. When Republicans called on Democrats to denounce their duplicitousness for trying to form a January 6th commission, or when Democrats labeled a dissenting colleague as corrupt for not wanting to eliminate the filibuster, they shifted from sharing and listening to accusing and condemning. The problem with this is that people typically respond better to self-based invitations than mind-driven ultimatums. Most of the time, the latter have the opposite effect of what's desired. They push people into even more extreme mind-focused defensiveness rather than fostering self-oriented openness. Now, admittedly, mind-based attacks feel good in the short term, but they have corrosive long-term consequences because mind begets mind. When we make others wrong, it drives them to make us wrong in return. For example, those aligned with Senator Manchin didn't react to assaults on his character by saying, gee, you have a point. How closed-minded of us. Rather, in response to attacks on him, they returned the favor and hit back with denunciations of their own. For example, Manchin defender Meghan McCain rebuked Manchin's Democratic critics on her TV show, The View. There's so many conversations about whether or not Republicans have had to bend the knee to Trump, she said. Well, do Democrats have to bend the knee to the Squad and everything on the far left? She asked. Because it looks like AOC and the Squad is dictating who is allowed in your party as well, she complained. Now, likewise, Republican refusal to support the proposed January 6th commission and their attacks on Democrats for supporting it didn't encourage people like former Republican Michael Steele, who supported the Democrats' proposal, to reconsider the Republican position. To the contrary, Republican attacks merely led Steele to castigate his former colleagues as, quote, pathetic cowards. So these examples of mind-focused blame and recriminations among political adversaries, unfortunately, are all too familiar. And the prospects for overcoming them, in many respects, seem bleak and feel bleak. However, context-centered therapy recommends a very simple and basic starting point for ameliorating the malign influence of mind in our political discourse. Awareness. If all of us, politicians and the citizens who follow them, were to simply begin paying attention to when we are operating from mind, we would likely notice immediate shifts in our experience and behavior. Identifying when Representative McCarthy calls the Democrats duplicative, or Representative Ocasio-Cortez accuses Senator Manchin of corruption, crystallizes how they're playing to our mind's sense of threat and its irrational need to win. It's difficult to imagine given our current political climate, but mere awareness of these dynamics is extremely powerful. Of course, politicians aren't always interested in such awareness because sometimes, just like the rest of us, they're animated by the benefits achieved by riling people's minds. As we have seen, the mind's desire to win at all costs is strong. So I'm not suggesting there will be a kumbaya moment when politicians and pundits permanently shift from mind-based blaming to self-oriented acceptance. The mind can be managed but never eliminated, especially in the political arena where the stakes are high and therefore feelings of threat are to be expected. However, if we can at least spot when politicians are playing to our minds, we will be better equipped to resist getting sucked into their mischief. And when we do successfully resist, they may need to adjust their tactics. Importantly, what is being encouraged is awareness, not condemnation. This mind-to-self contextual shift is critical because being mindful of the mind, rather than resisting it or reacting to others when they exhibit it, constitutes the first step towards surmounting it. Now, awareness is a good first step, but there's more that humanistic psychology has to offer. One of the ways context-centered therapy encourages improved relationships is by engaging people from self. Recall that the self is tolerant, caring, and loving. When we operate from it, we empathize and accept people as they are. And this sounds remarkably like Carl Rogers' person-centered therapy, especially his core conditions for change. Given this similarity, as well as Rogers' seminal attempts to apply his therapeutic ideas to transforming socio-political settings, person-centered therapy nicely supplements context-centered efforts to overcome political discord. Now, it is unfortunate that both person-centered and context-centered therapies speak of the self, because each defines the term differently. Rogers' person-centered self is more classically humanistic than Efron's context-centered self. It consists of innate aspects of personhood experienced as uniquely I, me, or mine. By contrast, Efron offers a more constructivist take on the self, viewing it as a universally built-in framework for empathically understanding the world. That, when adopted, constitutes how events are experienced and comprehended. Despite this difference, the context-centered self, with its focus on generosity, acceptance, empathy, and love, shares much in common with person-centered theorizing, in particular Rogers' core conditions. And as every therapist knows, Rogers described 3 core conditions that he believed were central to fostering client change: empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness. Empathy involves trying to see the world through others' eyes. We endeavor to understand their experiences, share their feelings, and inhabit their worldview. Empathy goes hand in hand with unconditional positive regard, wherein we aspire to accept others even when we disagree with them or with some of their actions. Finally, genuineness, or congruence, requires that we be self-consistent. If we wish to help others be true to themselves, we must be too. Operating from self in context-centered therapy can be equated with providing Rogers' core conditions. Context-centered therapists accept and love their clients. They empathize with their mind-driven anxieties, but because they recognize that construing and acting from mind is a part of being human, they don't pathologize or demonize their clients for doing so. In other words, knowing that it will only elicit further mind-driven behavior, context-centered therapists refrain from making their clients wrong. This is akin to person-centered therapists who, rather than judging clients or pointing out their irrationality, stick to empathizing with and unconditionally accepting them. Integratively speaking, providing core conditions constitutes an act of the context-centered self. Although Rogers didn't use the term mind, his analysis of why individuals, groups, and nations experience conflict often sounds like it was drawn directly from context-centered therapy. In applying person-centered theory to social conflicts, Rogers stressed the importance of transcending the inclination to make others wrong. In so doing, he anticipated Efron's warnings about the dangers of the mind. He noted that in all human conflict, whether it be marital discord, sectarian strife, or international disagreements, the combatants inevitably embrace 2 fundamental statements. The first is, I am right and you are wrong. And the second is, I am good and you are bad. Rogers expands on this by asking, quote, whether these actual tension situations you are considering do not also contain the following element of further value judgment. I am honest and straightforward and fundamentally good in my approach to our relationship and its problems. Unfortunately, you are none of these things. You are essentially bad and evil and untrustworthy in your approach to the whole situation. My motives are good. Yours are not. End of quote. Context-centered therapists would undoubtedly agree with Rogers' conclusion that, quote, these views, held in essentially identical fashion by each party to the dispute, characterize almost every serious tension situation, whether between individuals, groups, or nations. End of quote. When Rogers discourages condemning people and making them wrong, he sounds remarkably like Efron, who warns about wrong-making, triggering the mind's need to win and be right at all costs. Along these lines, Efron cautions that calling the mind wrong is self-defeating, because, he says, attempts to make it wrong merely increase its power. And he shares the following political example of the lengths the mind will go to when confronted. He says, at a press conference when President George W. Bush was forced to concede that we weren't winning the war in Iraq, he adopted the fallback position that we weren't losing either. And that kind of convoluted logic, according to Efron, is typical of the mind's insistence on maintaining the upper hand. Although mind-based blame and recriminations are fun while they last, they don't foster comedy and collaboration. Achieving constructive and cooperative social ends requires changing context, specifically moving from mind-driven wrong-making to self-based compassion and care. This is in sharp contrast to the penchant in many psychotherapy circles, as well as in our political discourse, where there remains a strong pull to disabuse people of their irrational beliefs, to call them out, to set them straight. Again, making our adversaries wrong may permit us to feel superior, but it very likely discourages them from reconsidering their positions. By comparison, context-centered and person-centered therapies substitute empathy and acceptance for blame and recrimination. Rogers accomplishes this by encouraging the spontaneous development of insight through the provision of warmth, permissiveness, understanding, and non-directiveness, while Efron stresses digital and instantaneous contextual shifts via awareness and acceptance of the mind from the observational perch of self. In both cases, they overcome the mind by commiserating with it rather than confronting it. So, what might person-centered efforts to remedy social tensions through a context-centered lens look like? How can empathizing with mind-based impulses rather than frontally assaulting them help us overcome political divisions? Rogers' seminal work adapting his empathy-first approach to the political arena affords very pertinent insights. Rogers devoted extensive time to how behavioral scientists can tackle the problem of social tensions. And he not only talked the talk, but he also walked the walk, routinely conducting encounter groups with members of political factions in conflict, including black and white South Africans during apartheid, government officials confronting challenges in Central America, and Soviet professionals during the Cold War. And Rogers' theories about the causes of social tension appear very consistent with Efron's ideas about mind and self. Rogers maintained that all conflicts share certain elements, regardless of whether they originate in personal, social, work, or political realms. First, he says, the combatants hold their beliefs rigidly rather than tentatively. From a context-centered view, this means they operate from mind instead of self. Second, communication breaks down. This is expected given that the mind prizes defending itself and being right over mutual understanding. Third, the participants distort one another's words and actions. The mind is highly partisan, inexorably misinterpreting others as a threat to be countered. Fourth, there's an absence of trust. Trust is foreign to the mind's playbook because it perceives others as adversaries out to inflict harm. To address social tensions, Rogers recommended the establishment of behavioral science task forces to, quote, advise governmental and private agencies involved in international, intercultural, and intercultural affairs, end of quote. He also outlined steps to reducing social tension, which can encourage mind-to-self contextual shifts. In Rogers' model, providing the core conditions of empathy, unconditional positive regard, and genuineness to individuals from dissenting political factions reduces defensiveness and elicits congruence. What Rogers calls defensiveness, Efron identifies as mind-based construing. Translating from person-centered to context-centered language, providing a supportive and non-judgmental environment for exploring differences, that is, establishing Rogers' core conditions, involves moving from mind to self. Congruence, again a synonym for genuineness, begs the question, congruence with what? From a context-centered perspective, congruence can be defined as accepting all aspects of one's experience, both those grounded in mind and self. So permitting the mind to do its thing constitutes a context-centered way of understanding congruence. Further, because what we resist persists, such congruence opens space for more self-oriented engagements with others. As the parties increasingly approach one another from the context of self, they come to empathize with one another. As such, they're able to shift from making judgments and demanding agreement to considering one another's interests while sharing their own concerns. So how does the Rogerian change process manifest itself in real life? Well, when working with constituencies in South Africa, Central America, and the Soviet Union, Rogers conducted encounter groups and trainings using person-centered principles. And in keeping with his theory, these sessions were generally non-directive, but often quite intense, with strong feelings expressed by the participants. Rogers' experience facilitating a mixed-race group in South Africa during the 1980s apartheid era offers an especially powerful analog to our current political and racial divides. Over the course of several meetings, group members shared their attitudes and feelings in a setting where they were encouraged to listen, empathize, and accept one another's experiences, even when that entailed some of them sharing flat-out racist and intolerant beliefs and impulses. For example, in one group session, a blonde woman of Danish descent named Karen shared how she, quote, had come to hate blacks for all the trouble they were causing, unquote. And the trouble to her mind was that, quote, there are too many blacks, unquote. And she lamented that when she went downtown, quote, where formerly whites were the predominant numbers, now it is blacks, and she wishes they would disappear, end quote. Karen's sentiments provide an unsettling example of mind-based threat and blaming. Of course, on the opposite end of the political spectrum was Fazio, who, quote, wanted it understood that he could not accept anyone who is not anti-racist, anti-bourgeois, and anti-capitalist. Rogers also noted that Fabio's statement, a clear but relatable manifestation of the mind's preference for righteous indignation over understanding and reconciliation, was met with horror by some of the more conservative whites in the group. Again, mind begets mind. The sessions Rogers led were at times painful and upsetting to participants, but they yielded results that pleased and surprised Rogers, and which, through a context-centered lens, reflect the positive changes that accompany mind-to-self transitions. Rogers noted how people of vastly different racial and political backgrounds came to form a shared basis for communication and cooperation. By the end of the sessions, Rogers reported how, quote, Karen, who was initially arrogant and apathetic, Fazio, who was initially Marxist and intolerant, and Arva, a radical young black woman, had become very close, end of quote. And they were united in their desire to teach others about the person-centered methods they were learning. From this, Rogers concluded that if leaders from all the major South African groups could be brought together in what he considered a prolonged, facilitated person-to-person meeting, that he was convinced a peaceful solution would be found to their problems. The divisions of 1980 South Africa were certainly as large or larger than those we face today. Might we, as humanistic psychologists, be able to provide an invaluable service to Americans locked in political combat by modeling, facilitating, and teaching the kinds of communication Rogers championed? What possibilities for change might emerge if we did? Would we see less mind and more self? So a few concluding thoughts. Perhaps President Biden's call for unity, and my optimism about using context and person-centered conceptualizations to advance it, strikes you as naive. That's understandable. Rogers himself faced this very same pessimism. He recounted speaking to a despairing reporter during his South African trip. The reporter doubted that Rogers' efforts would be effective, comparing it to placing a wet cloth on a burning lake. I too have moments where I'm convinced that nothing can be done to improve things, and that we will never be able to overcome our partisan rancor. When I recognize these feelings of despair as products of my mind working to protect me in its predictably limited way, my certainty that all is lost recedes. The mind will always be with us in all its ugliness. It's part of who we are. But so is the self, and from it, I draw hope for the prospects of a more unified tomorrow. Thank you very much.
I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Drake Spaeth, past president of Division 32, the Society for Humanistic Psychology of the American Psychological Association. He is the psychology chair of Humanistic and Clinical Psychology at Saybrook University. Dr. Spaeth is an alumnus of the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, where he served as faculty member for 14 years. He is a former U.S. Air Force psychologist, serving as a psychology resident at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Chief of Inpatient Psychology at Lackland Air Force Base, and has served as Clinical Director of Residential Treatment Centers for Adolescents. Dr. Spaeth's publications and presentations are in the area of trauma, spirituality, spiritual emergencies, depth psychology, eco psychology, existential living, and rites of passage. Here is Dr. Drake Spaeth.
Thank you, Jonathan, for this thoughtful and insightful offering. Your advocacy for a more constructive and frankly hopeful approach to political discourse, one which is grounded in historical precedents as well as our intertwined legacies of humanistic and constructivist psychology, and which is applicable in both public and government contexts, is certainly timely. It is also a very welcome anodyne to the suffering engendered by the unrelenting othering and the us versus them mentality that dominates discourse. This polarization toward extreme positions, disrespectful communication, and violence that is, quote, killing us, unquote, as existential psychologist Kirk Schneider has stated, you have also substantively considered here. What you describe here, in fact, reminds me very much of his work with experiential democracy, which also identifies the necessity of being able to fully and deeply listen to those whose expressed values and positions one finds to be repugnant or antithetical to one's own, specifically those that one experiences as being core or central to their identity. I appreciate your assertion that the values of humanistic and constructivist psychology and our willingness to represent them courageously in the face of contemporary hostility offer real and even pragmatic answers to the psychological pain that is evident in the fragmentation in our humanity. This pain is manifest in racial and class conflicts, divides, and violence. As the novelist, poet, and activist James Baldwin famously said, I imagine that one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. Psychologists, like most, may not do so well in addressing hatred, but psychological pain is a province that we do, in fact, know very well indeed. We help our clients deal with pain and suffering in many forms. Humanistic psychology emphasizes moving from fragmentation into meaningful wholeness, and how the experience of having an authentic self relationally emerges from interactions and relationships with others. Constructivism embraces the notion that human beings meaningfully create order from the environmental chaos through which they wade over the course of a lifetime, and a sense of self coherently emerges from this process of testing assumptions, beliefs, attitudes, and values in their experience of the world, spurred and guided by curiosity and humility. Both value what Rogers called tentative rather than absolute ways of construing and understanding the world. In your talk, your points about liberation from mind to communicate from self seem to be very much in alignment with these notions. I also appreciate your point that even humanistic and constructivist psychologists succumb to dogmatic rhetoric and become entangled in mind, we may be losing sight of the historical perspective of our legacy and become less effective in modeling our values in ways that encourage and inspire others. By fostering and nurturing greater awareness of our vulnerability to these pressures, we can be more effective in dealing with our own pain and fragmentation. Our ability to communicate from a place of serenity can attract others regarding the prospect of doing the same, and we can teach others about the value of communicating differently. I do feel that Carl Rogers understood that full embodiment and expression of selfhood organically leads to and even necessitates what he referred to as pro-social behaviors and strivings. We do not operate in a vacuum when it comes to the self. On a very basic level, how do I know I'm a friendly person until I have someone with whom I can be friendly? I'm reminded of Tom Hanks in the movie Castaway, where he even made a volleyball into a person, Wilson, so that he could at least approximatively experience his selfhood in connection and relationship with another. We need each other for full expression of selfhood. Selfhood is inherently pro-social in this regard. We also need to be fully aware of what is evoked in us in our experience of the world and social relationships. We confront the pain of the inevitable discovery that we ourselves are not free from the racism and hatreds that we decry in what we perceive and attribute to others. In so doing, we expand beyond those rigid limitations. The self can hold our past indoctrination and acculturatively embrace a more global human understanding. And we can nurture compassion for and patience with ourselves in the process. Jonathan, in this, I appreciated very much your point that Rogers showed us how we can embrace, affirm, and nurture each other's personhood no matter what. Someone may appear to us to be antithetical to everything that is good and just and right, and we can affirm that they are a person and a human being with whom we are sharing the world. We can still have and embrace all of our personal values, and we can still fight freely and fiercely for global social justice in the ways we personally espouse. You described what is needed here as a willingness to take active steps toward moving from being trapped in mind into communicating from self. You further showed how cultivating self-awareness makes this possible, and how Rogers historically and successfully accomplished something similar through facilitated dialogues. Phenomenology also illuminates the path, as it were, in that moving from mind into self entails bracketing our preconceptions, biases, and strong feelings about others and our experiences of the world. Restoring our ability to be genuinely surprised by what we encounter in those whom we hate, and eliminating confirmation bias. I see what you're talking about here as dovetailing with mindfulness meditation and approaches. Mindfulness is the ability and intentional willingness to take an observer stance toward what is otherwise fused with what you refer to as mind. In fact, I'm amused by the irony of the idea that by being mindful, in one sense at least, full of mind, that perhaps paradoxically liberation from mind in the sense that you mean it here becomes possible. As I said, doing so allows one to be led by curiosity and humility and to be genuinely surprised and even transformed by our dialogic encounters with those whom we find difficult or repugnant. This consideration of mindfulness reminds me that historical precedent here also goes even further and much deeper than the recent entry just over 100 years ago of psychology into this picture. What you are talking about here seems to me to be a way of appreciating and acknowledging our debt of gratitude to indigenous wisdom from many traditions that converge around the notion that when we speak and live from our heads alone and fail to follow a path of the heart, we disconnect from what makes us not only, but from what makes us human, but also, in fact, interconnected with the natural world. Speaking and living from the heart entails everything that you have articulately, hopefully, and passionately advocated for here, moving out of fragmentation and head-based polarized rhetoric into dialogue grounded in the whole self. To conclude, I also discern here an ethical and moral imperative. If we refuse to change how we communicate and engage in relationship with others here, we continue to endanger ourselves and the planet and its denizens. I feel that to do successfully what you are advocating for here, it is not enough to embrace even the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, although even that would help. The deepest level of that rule, which some have termed the platinum rule, is necessary. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them. If we are unable to relate from that level of empathy, we will be unable to deal with the pain that fragments us. Thank you.
Thank you so much for attending the presidential address today for Division 32. We hope to have a no-holds-barred discussion in the hospitality suite right after this, so please join us there. Thanks again for coming.